We are joined now by a member of the self-described gender-critical movement. Edie Wyatt writes on culture, politics and feminism, which you can read on her Substack, missediewyatt.substack.com. Welcome to Spectator TV.
Thank you for having me.
It's fair to say that a large chunk of the Spectator readership is still relatively new to the whole trans, LGBT, self-ID portfolio of activism. These issues sort of stormed the headlines in the last couple of years. Before that, they were not really a topic for the mainstream. This has led to an interesting mix of ideological groups sitting on either side of the fence when it comes to the rapid deconstruction of biological sex. Now, you described yourself as gender-critical feminist. What does that mean, gender-critical?
I think generally it means that we're critical of all the legislation that comes from gender identity as a protected characteristic in law. I think that was introduced pretty much around 2013 in Australian law when Julia Gillard changed the Sex Discrimination Act to include trans women and to remove the biological definitions of male and female, or man and woman, I think it was. So, yeah, I've been involved for about 4 years. And it's because of the effect of those laws on women. Those laws do disproportionately affect women. We see a lot of the peripheral stuff in the news about, you know, uterus havers and all that sort of stuff that the right pick up on that's ridiculous. And then the left call it all inclusive and they've all gone insane. So I think gender critical is generally a non-partisan. We sort of sit just with a single issue and we're critical of the concept that gender can literally change your sex because it's damaging to women and homosexuals. Yeah.
Well, your article in The Spectator this week raises several important gender-based issues that are happening in Australia and indeed around the world. The first is the introduction of gender identity into state legislation. You add that this disempowers the protected characteristic of sex and sexual orientation. Can you elaborate on why this is so dangerous and which groups are being put specifically at risk by the ideological legislation? And maybe even, I don't know if you could tell us why this has come out of nowhere all of a sudden, because people are a little bit surprised that they're having these conversations all of a sudden.
Yeah, well, there's been a black ban, right, on the reporting of it. So the ABC, a lot of the media has been, we call it captured by organisations like ACON, who consider it, it's a strategic plan. We know it's a strategic plan by the LGBT lobby to keep that out of news, to say, well, it's harmful to trans people to even speak about this stuff. So what was your question again? Sorry.
Well, people are wondering, first of all, where this came from, like why all of a sudden we're talking about it, but also which protected groups are being put most at risk by this legislation?
Yes. Well, because with self-ID in Queensland, it means that any man can turn up to the birth, deaths and marriages and change his birth certificates to say female, and that will give him access to all, for all intents and purposes, to be treated as a female. Now, for women need to identify man as a basic safeguarding risk, because almost all sex crime, violent crime is men, right? So I think it's 97% of all sex offenders are male. So there is a basic safeguarding principle of women, so women can separate themselves. The most vulnerable people are, of course, people who are disabled, who can't, for instance, if you need intimate care, you can't say that you want a male person. You can say that, but you'll get, a female person. You can say you want a female person, but you'll get a male person who self-identifies. You can get that. And all they need to do, they don't need to make any changes. They need to go down to the registry office, change their sex marker, and they can get access to all the assumptions that we have in our culture and in our society, in our laws, that women have. That means that we're free. Women are not innocent of all crimes, but generally they're free of what we call male pattern violence and male pattern sexual deviancy. So they access the assumption, and that's a safeguarding risk. It's a massive safeguarding risk, as we saw with the Catholic Church when people presumed that priests were free of male pattern violence and male pattern sexual deviancy, which of course they weren't. It's impossible. It's ridiculous.
Well, self-ID is something that most people are now getting familiar with because it's been attached to pretty high-profile stories here and particularly in the United States, where we've got women going into changing rooms and bathrooms at gyms, for instance, and then they are finding themselves kicked out or threatened with litigation because they didn't want to see a man in these intimate spaces. Now, self-ID effectively means that biology is meaningless, that the protections afforded to sex segregation are now based on feelings rather than reality. Now, to contradict this makes you a bigot, essentially, and we might talk more about that in a couple of weeks. But surely there was a justified reason behind sex segregation. You've touched on it saying male pattern violence, but are we looking at a new reality where we're saying that, you know, if a man says they're a woman, well, then they are to be afforded those rights? Because we hear all the time trans rights are human rights, but what they're doing is affording themselves additional rights, rights that belong to a protected sexual category. Is that correct?
That's right, yeah. Well, women have fought very hard for their rights. I mean, we have not only just the right to vote, which is the most famous one, but feminists also fought for the right for for instance, for the age of consent to be raised, because young girls were being trafficked in the UK and into Europe into sex slavery. So, and also for surrogacy and things like that. So there's a range of rights that women have fought for that this whole movement is undermining, because it undermines the basis on which women are oppressed. So the categories we have in law which protect oppression are based in the liberal principle of the tyranny of the majority, right? The concept of liberalism is to protect the individual from tyranny, mostly tyranny of the state, but also from the tyranny of each other. So the way that women have won their rights is to say that women have particular vulnerabilities that come from their reproductive role, and they need protection from those things. When we go into a bathroom in public, for instance, I mean, even public facilities are reasonably new. We've only had them around 100 years for women. We've had them for men, obviously, but women couldn't go out in public because they called it the urinary leash, because they would get harassed in the toilets because of male pattern violence. So it's about protecting the vulnerability. The history of feminism has been about the protection of the vulnerability of the female body. It's not about the female gender soul. Even a very masculine woman still has a female body and is subject to the vulnerabilities of the female sex.
It's not about the performance of womanhood, as some of these activists go on about. It is about the biological reality of being a woman. But let's get to a slightly scarier part of your article. When it comes to gender transitioning, you put up an alarming statistic that the collapse of the UK's Tavistock Gender Service has revealed, and that is that 90% of girls referred to the facility were same-sex attracted, and the majority of all referrals to gender clinics, including those in Australia, are girls. In 2023, 172 children in Queensland started, this is children, not adults, children, started puberty blockers, with the majority ending up on a path to cross-sex hormones. This, you say, means that when they become adults, they will be adults in name only, as their development has been interrupted. Now, what does this mean for the next generation of young women who may be same-sex attracted? Because if I'm reading this correctly, we are going, no matter what happens, there is going to be a significant percentage of young people who grow up with this having happened to them.
That's right. Well, the thing about gender nonconformity, we try to make not a big deal about it, right? Feminists used to say that we can be whatever we like in our expression. But the problem is gender nonconformity is a pre-indicator for homosexuality. We know that in statistics, we know that anecdotally, if a little boy is very feminine, we kind of know he might end up to be gay. And we're kind of okay with that now. That's what a progressive society is. But the problem is these kids are being pulled into this ideology, which says you are literally, little girls particularly, if they're very masculine, they like to do boy things, they're being told that they could literally be boys. And what's more dangerous is they could escape from really the misogyny that is so embedded in pornography and everywhere in our society. So it's actually endocrine. It's conversion therapy with hormones, because they're coming in and they're turning them into straight men, right? So it's another form of conversion therapy. There was a dark joke at the Tavistock Clinic in the UK that soon there'll be no gay people because they'll all be converted. But the problem with it, the main problem with it, is that it stops their puberty. And in Queensland, it's a massive problem. in the clinic in New South Wales, they did some research, right? So they started to reduce the use of puberty blockers, and so some kids are even travelling up to Queensland, or parents, to have their children have their puberty stopped. It's very aggressive and it'll be the medical scandal of our time. There's no question in my mind, because we don't know. You say, what's going to be the result? We don't know actually what the result is to completely stop puberty. We don't know what the long-term results are. We know that it affects bone density. We know that the health complications of testosterone on female bodies is terrible. It causes all sorts of issues early. Like, a lot of these girls are going through menopause before they've even had puberty. So I'm going through menopause. I'm 52. So they're facing those issues as children. It's a travesty, and there's no research for it. There's even the top gender doctor in Queensland has admitted that there's no evidence that this is effective in helping mental distress, which is what they say that their objective is.
Well, what we've really got is the activists trapping a generation of children in childhood where they never get the opportunity to grow up and find out who they really are. They say it's all about being your true self, but these children are being robbed of their true self because they're being taken hold of when they're very young and they don't know what they want. I mean, if you look at the statistics, what's going to happen to the vast majority of these kids is they're either going to be straight and they would have grown out of it, and so now they're trapped in a body that they reject because they want their old body back, or they will be gay or same-sex attracted, and now they don't have the body they need to fulfil their emotional desires as they become adults. It's actually a complete tragedy what they've done. But I'd like to finish with an excellent quote from your article in which you wrote, and I quote, "To the honest liberal I ask, if the government can invent a social justice category, redefine human sex in law, create funding and be selective when it comes to damaging science and philosophy, all to reinforce power, isn't that a government expanding into tyranny?" End quote. Look, we've only got a couple of minutes, but do you feel as this is becoming a tyrannical directive over particularly the same-sex portion of our population?
Yes, well, the gender identity component of not only this legislation but hate speech legislation, it disciplines the population into lying. It disciplines women into lying and not seeing what is before their eyes. So it's extremely tyrannical. It's really, I don't know how any liberals can support it. I don't know why they call them moderate liberals who support this gender identity in law, because it's a disaster and we need to face it.
Well, let's hope that the Australian community can come together and protect our children, protect women's rights, and indeed just protect every citizen from this outrageous ideology that's sweeping through our legislation. Thank you so much for joining us here today on Spectator TV.
Thanks for having me.